The fact remains, the US needs China more than China needs the US. China needs nothing from the US that it can produce itself or buy from elsewhere. China can also enforce a trade embargo on the US, as the rest of the world is quite prepared to buy what China would otherwise sell to the US. In such a scenario, who stands to lose the most? Not China.
Azlan Adnan.
This comment reflects a provocative and increasingly popular line of thinking that challenges the long-held assumption of US dominance in global trade. It frames the US-China economic relationship through the lens of shifting interdependence, asserting that China, once seen as reliant on US markets and technology, is now in a position of relative autonomy and strategic flexibility. There is some truth to the claim. China has diversified its trading partners through initiatives like the Belt and Road and has become deeply embedded in the global South supply chains. It has also made strides in domestic innovation, particularly in sectors like electric vehicles, renewable energy, and telecoms. The US, meanwhile, continues to rely heavily on China for a vast array of manufactured goods, rare earths, and intermediate components. However, the notion that China needs nothing from the US may be overstated. China still depends on American and allied technologies in high-end semiconductors, aviation, biotech, and financial infrastructure. Despite major investment in self-reliance, it remains vulnerable to choke points in these areas. Moreover, a unilateral Chinese embargo on the US would be economically self-damaging and geopolitically provocative, potentially accelerating global decoupling in ways that hurt both economies. Ultimately, both powers are deeply entwined in a codependent economic relationship, though the balance is indeed shifting. The more pertinent question may not be who needs whom more, but whether either can afford full decoupling without triggering global economic fragmentation. From a supply chain perspective, Azlan Adnan's comment taps into a real and growing asymmetry, but it also underplays key mutual dependencies, particularly in high-value sectors. China's strength in supply chain resilience. Over the past 2 decades, China has become the linchpin of global manufacturing. It controls significant portions of the world's midstream and downstream supply chains, especially in electronics. China dominates the assembly of consumer electronics, with control over intermediate inputs and final production. Rare earth elements. It processes over 80% of global rare earths, essential for defense, renewable energy, and high-tech applications. Battery and EV value chains. China leads in lithium-ion battery production, processing of raw materials, and electric vehicle assembly. Medical and pharmaceutical ingredients. It supplies key active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, used worldwide, including in the US. In these areas, China could indeed redirect goods to other markets, ASEAN, Global South, EU, especially as it pursues dual circulation, a strategy to reduce reliance on Western export markets while deepening domestic and regional consumption. US vulnerabilities and retaliation constraints. The US, meanwhile, remains highly dependent on Chinese manufacturing for finished goods and critical components. Even with friendshoring and reshoring efforts gaining momentum under the Biden administration, the short-term substitutability of China is limited. The COVID-19 pandemic and the 2021-22 semiconductor crisis showed how fragile the US and global supply chains can be. A Chinese embargo could seriously disrupt consumer markets. US retailers and brands rely on Chinese factories for everything from iPhones to clothing. Industrial inputs. US manufacturing sectors import complex subcomponents assembled in Chinese factories. Green transition. A sudden break in supply from China would undermine US targets for EVs and renewable energy deployment. However, China is not invulnerable. It still relies on the US, EU, and Japan for cutting-edge semiconductors, chip-making equipment, aerospace components, and financial technologies. Moreover, While the US imports from China heavily, it also has enormous power via its control over dollar clearing systems, export controls, and the global dominance of firms like Nvidia, ASML, via Dutch cooperation, and TSMC. Through US alignment with Taiwan. Supply chain decoupling is costly, for both. Full decoupling would fragment the global economy into rival blocs, creating higher costs, duplication of industrial ecosystems, and massive logistical inefficiencies. China has already felt the strain from US export controls in AI and chipmaking. The US, in turn, would struggle to replace China's speed, scale, and cost-effectiveness without significant inflationary pressures. In short, China has increased its supply chain resilience and geopolitical leverage, but mutual dependency is still constrained both powers. While Beijing could hurt Washington by withholding key goods, it would simultaneously damage its own exports, foreign investment appeal, and domestic employment. The most likely scenario, then, remains a selective decoupling around strategic technologies rather than a total break.
forget to hit that subscribe button to show your support.